Well, good evening and welcome to the India Law Forum and LITFest, 82nd SKOCH Summit. The book under discussion today is entitled India, that is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution by Mr. J. Sai Deepak. It explores the underpinnings of the idea of Bharat by first traveling into the history to excavate the corrosion of the idea, and as lawyers do, offering evidence of its sustenance and subsequently paved the way for a decolonized interpretation of the Constitution. The book argues that while the colonization of the Indian landscape may have been reversed, the minds continue to be possessed and ultimately handicapped by a historical narrative that the outsiders set for us. It says that landmark cases often form the unpopular side of the debate, including siding by the temple's ritualistic right to deny women entry into the Sabrimala temple case. Author's position is that the deity too should be able to assert its rights. The book is a first in a trilogy exploring various subjects related to the Indic civilizational history and its immediate anxiety. The first half of the book traces the history of the Indian conscience, as it was bruised and molded by the intervention of the poet. And the second half, I leave it for that, for the discussion and panelists and introduce the author of the book. Mr. J. Sai Deepak, advocate, Supreme Court of India, an engineer turned lawyer, and has been a litigator since July 2009. He was an associated partner at Sri Krishna and Associates. In close to 13 years of practice, he has carved a niche for himself in civil commercial litigation, IP litigation, constitutional law, and competition law. Dr. Rinku Vadera, core faculty, Council for Historical and Sociological Research, 25 years in teaching. Her areas of specialization include folk loristics, women's studies, and philosophy. She has written extensively on existentialism, Upanishads, and burdens of Hinduness, quote unquote, among several other topics in a number of genres. Professor Shilpa Pandit is with School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University, teaching psychology. She has worked with several community-based organizations as an expert in areas of research and policy implications for gender, rural employment, livelihoods, youth, and health. As a Shivling scholar, she became particularly interested in entrepreneurship and the intersections of science, arts, and humanities for problems and solutions on issues that confront us today. Professor Ashwin Kumar, Amrit Modi School of Management, spent over a decade in teaching and researching cultural studies. Cultural interests are primarily in philosophy and culture, cultural theory, and conceptual history. His book, Nationalism, Language and Identity in India, Measures of Community, was published recently. Our moderator for today's show, Mr. Raghav Krishnan, founder and CEO, Bharat LLC, culture, creative and policy research with 17 years of corporate experience and expertise in leading cross-functional creative product development teams, learning design, and organization culture. He was development director at Electronic Arts. After his corporate stint, he moved into public policy and was the co-founder and associate dean of academics at Rashtraman School of Public Leadership. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back today. And hand over the mic to Raghav.
Right. Good evening, and thank you, Dr. Dhanji. But I've asked for a better panel to get us forth on this conversation today about an important book of cultural significance. I'll make a few opening remarks, and then we'll have pointed questions at each of the panel members, and we also have a provision for some curated Q&A towards the end. But I just was reflecting on what this moment means for us. There is in the world that I come from business and product development and creative industry, the ultimate dream for any product developer or a brand, for that matter, is when your product or your service becomes a verb, when it actually, when the action that your service helps perform and the name of the brand, become one. You think about Xerox, you think about Google. When it actually mainstreams, that's when the idea finds its ultimate destination. So, what does this mean for a book about an idea, about a civilization? Right? When does a book find its own Purushartha? And I've been on a panel with Sai Deepakji early on when the book released. And at that time, we had spoken about what is the journey of this book and how we would like to see this being consumed. And I think it's fair to say, and we would reflect on that today, that the Purushartha sadhana for this is when the book actually becomes a part of your social, academic, political, cultural vocabulary. And I think it's fair to say that the book that we're celebrating today, and it's a great occasion that it's a befitting recognition for an important work, has now imbued the cultural consciousness. And wherever I observe, whether it's online or in offline conversations or in academic portals, there is a lot of interest and there's a lot of debate around the ideas that have been generated in this book. And I think that's what a great book does. A great book opens your thought process and it provokes you to ask some questions or look at the way you've always been thinking and see if you can gain a fresh perspective. And I'm very, very keen to just have the conversation today with this erudite panel on how this book has impacted their disciplines. And the way we've been thinking about this conversation, given that the book is drawing close to a year since its release and has already generated significant debate, is not just about the content of the book, which has been fairly well discussed in public forums, but how does this book become a part of a future forming process? Right? Whether it is academic research or mainstream work, I think the ultimate destination is the well-being of the welfare of the public, and whether our work can contribute to that in any meaningful way. So the focus that we have in today's panel is to see how the book can inform different disciplines and how practitioners, academicians, and thinkers are consuming this work and blending it with their work to provide us new perspectives for problem solving. But with that, I'd like to open it with a quick question to Sai Deepakji to help us reflect through this journey. Sai Deepakji, namaste. Good evening, and great to be back on a panel with you. And the last time that we had spoken about this book, we had looked at it as three dimensions, right? There was the movement. What is the movement that led to the publishing or even the thinking around a book like this? What sort of political consciousness, cultural consciousness generates movements like this, right? And then we spoke about the method and the method that you have chosen to advance your argument about decoloniality and the framework that you used. And there's been a fair amount of debate on that, and I think that should continue informing us. And then there was also the mantle. And that was the whole idea that the work is not for a personal satisfaction. The work is of cultural significance in the way ideas are formed and consumed by public at large. I think it's fair to say now that the mantle has been passed on to the public. And at that time, we didn't think about a movement. And from what I see from the discourse that I follow, congratulations, the book has become a movement. People have embraced it and people have owned it. And I think it has made a huge difference to the way people looked at their own history. And I think there is a moment of awakening today. And this book is a significant part of that journey. But my question is more, on the future and what this portends, what this book contributes to. If you know everything that you know today about the method, about the mantle, about the movement, and about the subject at large, when you started writing this book, what would how different would that book be? Are there parts of this which would be different, or would you do something differently? Just walk us through your own reflexive journey in the last 1 year.
So I think the first and the second questions are related for the simple reason that I don't think the book has created a movement. The book is the product of a movement. And the understanding of a movement is typically ex post facto. In its origins and perhaps in its midterm, people don't realize that there is a movement underway. Its codification and its understanding or theorization is typically ex post facto. So I would assume that my work is merely to use, in fact, Mr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta's words. I've said this myself, that the book is not original in the sense that this is not something path breaking, but it is perhaps more systematic. and which is where I bring my training as a lawyer to bear as far as my presentation of the content is concerned. So strictly speaking, to put it in legal parlance, this is a codification of existing material which is strewn across platforms and in several planes. The idea was to connect all the dots and put it under one umbrella. Now, to the second question as to whether I would do it any differently, I don't think the book is remotely perfect. I don't think anybody is even making those claims. But I would leave it as imperfect as it is for only one good reason. Because the first book is always an attempt at ventilating what you feel and you've been trying to articulate in multiple platforms. So the rawness and even the lack of sophistication in certain areas are necessary, because I think more than understanding whether there is depth to it, I think the first thing that a reader tries to understand is whether the book is the product of pretentious behavior, is it an affectation, or does it reflect sincerity and commitment? I wanted that particular commitment to come through with all its flaws. And if at all there are any changes to be made, I thought I'll do it in the second and the third books. But as far as the first book is concerned, I was convinced to the extent that I had done my homework in terms of the message that I was trying to put out. And regardless of its, let's say, lacunae, so to speak, I wanted the audience to consume it lock, stock, and barrel, and then critique it and do whatever it wants to. I wanted the audience to take ownership of it. So to answer your question, I don't think I'd have done it any differently whatsoever, because then the sheer energy behind the book would have been lost in trying to polish it. And sometimes energy just needs to be put out as is where is. And that's what the book does. And that's no wonder it is connected with the audience that I wanted it to, which is the youth. Notwithstanding the dense, lawyerly language that's been used in it, which makes for sometimes fairly tedious reading, for students to have actually taken it up and for having framed such scintillating sharp questions. I can expect sharp questions from perhaps a humanities college or a department. But 2 weeks ago in BITS Pilani Hyderabad campus, the kind of questions that were thrown at me, and they were so beautifully framed and phrased, that tells me that the object of the book and its mission to that extent has been achieved, which is to give them some kind of a framework and a lens to begin with. So to that extent, I think I would not tamper with the book at all.
Fantastic. No, you write a scholarly work, but you speak like an artist, because the vulnerability that you speak of, to be able to expose yourself and put your most authentic self out for scrutiny and to invite such feedback, that is what an artistic process goes through, right? An artist, when he or she puts out a performance, it is out there, and after that, it's the performance that speaks for the artist. And so there is the streak of an artist in you, perhaps, that we have missed so far. But also just the point about authenticity and putting out the truth to the best of your ability, and then letting the audience decide. I think great works not just give us knowledge, not just give us a new perspective or a new way of looking at things, but they also inspire us to rise above ourselves and think deeper on issues. And this is not just in BITS Pilani. I've followed that talk. I've seen this consistently across all of your public appearances as far as this book is concerned, that the questions have increasingly become more complex, more urgent, and more sincere. And I think that is it's a great moment of awakening. And I think there is a role then for educators, for families even, for parents now to take this consciousness forward and see how this can actually be channelized into something productive. So to that extent, thank you for kindling that fire. I'll come back to you, but I want to take this to Professor Ashwin Kumar, who's written extensively about language, nationalism, tradition, and the intersection of all of these. And he's thought deeply about both the colonial consciousness and Christian theology that your book also touches on, and the impact it has had on the on just the way we understand ourselves. So I'd like to ask Professor Ashwin Kumar first up on how he has approached this work. In some ways, it is tangential. In some ways, it is additive. But I'd like to know what are the commonalities and what are the departures.
Sure. First of all, thanks a lot for SKOCH and all of you for having me here. This was my initial impression after reading Sai Deepak's book, that there are some works here you're happy that they exist. but there are some books you want them to exist. You would rather say, can't someone just get the thing written? And this is, I think, one of those urgent books. And that sense of urgency comes through in every single page. And I think what Deepak just now mentioned is only a testimony to that. So I was extremely happy to read that book. But that puts me in a problematic situation, because as academics, we are happier critiquing and criticizing, and we know how to do that. But traveling with a book, thinking along, is a harder task, and that's what I'm trying to do here. There's of course a lot of things that the book covers, but for the paucity of time and to keep it slightly sharper, I'll just focus on a couple of the more programmatic questions I think that Sai Deepak wants us to pay attention to. And those programmatic questions, I suppose, will get answered in the sequels to this book. But it's important that we keep that in the mind while we are discussing this book. So there's a lot of historical and analytical work that's there in the book, but I'm just going to assume that the readers are going to read it and appreciate it themselves. And I'll not be really commenting on that. One of the biggest programmatic question for me was, and this is also the question that Deepak himself raises, is what is it to realize a civilizational state in India as against the received model of the Westphalian nation state? Okay. Now, there are a couple of things that quickly comes into mind. The moment we ask a question like this, we are in slightly risky territory. And I think congratulations to Deepak for taking up such a risky thing. I would sort of fear to tread there yet. What's the risk we're talking about? The risk is this, that when we're talking about realizing a civilizational state, are we thinking of realizing a model? Versus, are we talking about something else, like attending to our experiences, which are being distorted in the current situation of the Eurocentric thinking system? Now, this realizing a model versus attending to experiences is a slightly larger contrast. It's not a serendipity, I think, that much of the Western thinking on, say, normative ethics and social theory on political structures is about realizing a model. John Rawls has a model. He thinks this is a model worth realizing. John Locke, I mean, all the Johns, beginning from Milton, Locke, and Mill, and our own Rawls. If liberalism is the story of the four or five Johns, they've all tried to realize a model. There is something deeply theological in the exact way that Deepak is talking about, in thinking about the society, the social, as a realization of a model. In contrast, you have most Indian intellectual traditions, whether they are the Darshana traditions, Vedantic and non-Vedantic, or even the Smriti and the Arthashastra traditions, which don't quite push towards realizing a model. Now, there is no model, there's no Advaita model, there is no Buddhist model. What there is an attention to experience and a certain dissolution of a dissolving of avidya of various kinds, right? So the larger programmatic question then becomes for the modern world, when realizing a model is the way in which the Westphalian nation state talk has gone on, how will we change our approach to the problem? Rather than saying we have our model to realize, should we be talking in a slightly different language of saying that there is something else here. And if that is something else, and if that is, like I am suggesting, attending to our own experience, how would that be done at a larger scale, at a larger than the individual scale? So that was one large bunch of concerns. I have two more, and I'll quickly stop there. Now, an example for that is this, that when I say attending to experience, look at some of the institutions that we bemoan today, the things that we think are wrong and bad, the religious mathas, the temples, the caste groups, the khap panchayats. These are precisely the institutions which are bad and wrong and things we have to run away from. But ideally speaking, even if you were to take the experience of medieval Europe and things like that, these are the kind of institutions which are the brick and mortar of building a larger polity. The state is actually simply an icing on these social institutions. The modern Indian state, like I think Deepak will largely agree with me, is not an outgrowth of the existing social institutions. It is an imposition from somewhere else. Not only that, even the most well-meaning of us would only want to criticize and bemoan the existence of these kinds of institutions. So this is one example where we are probably not attending to our experience. Yeah. So this was one set of concerns. The second was, something that really hit me when I was reading the parts where Deepak was discussing Ram Mohan Roy's letter and Macaulay's minute and all of that. Now, we have read Ram Mohan Roy, we have read Macaulay, but we have not read it probably in the framework which Deepak has put for us. And that's where it appeared to me that here is a question. Come on, we may say that what Ram Mohan Roy and Macaulay are saying is deeply imbricated in a colonial theological Christian worldview. But this is the best possible description for most of us even today, which means the real challenge is, how do you reconstruct what Macaulay and Ram Mohan Roy are saying as, these ritualistic, mind-numbing practices and philological texts and scholastic traditions? How do you reconstruct them as knowledge? Because today they are not knowledge. We may be proud of the fact that, some of us may be proud of the fact that these things exist, but I don't think we have the first clue about what is it to reconstitute these things as knowledge, which is to say that even to this day, the last word is Ram Mohan Roy's and Macaulay's. It is not the opposite. It's not anything other than that. So it's a very, very serious challenge. The first step, of course, is what Sai Deepak has taken, which is to show that there are assumptions here which are not universal. They're only falsely universal. But from there to reconstitute those traditions as knowledge is, I think, a huge task ahead. And I'd love to see how one can think about that. Just a quick reference. I was recently reading the philosopher Jonathan Lear, who has this wonderful book called Radical Hope, which asks a similar kind of question with the American Indians. The American Indian tribes say that once we moved to the reservations, the American Indian reservations, things stopped. History stopped for us. There's nothing else that happened after that. Well, a lot of things happened for them. They went through trauma of, the same kind of colonialism, the same kind of Western imperialism, hegemony, etc. But things just stopped because the world which constituted and transmitted your experience and learning stopped. How do you now reconstitute that as knowledge is a question Lear asks. And that's probably the question that India, that is Bharat, is pushing us to ask. And finally, the third part, which is it's a slightly paradoxical thing, both with the book and with the author. He's a lawyer with the apex court of the country, and this book is also about law. Now, much of the situation of the West, what we are calling the the Christian theological model is actually realized in the modern West, post-Protestant, post-secular West, through a process of the universalization and autonomization of law. Yeah. So law is the problem child here. But in a peculiar way, you know that today the battle is with law. I mean, if you have to do something about decolonization, you have to eventually talk about legislation, law, jurisprudence, and things like that. Now, this is, I mean, as of now, I can only see this as a paradox, but I'm sure Deepak is a better person to tell us more about that. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much for that very insightful take on what this book means. It also took me back to your explanation of tradition as learnables versus explainables, and what constitutes our attentive and attendant sort of experiences, and how do we reconstitute knowledge with this sort of movement. I think in a way maybe it's also about using this book as a means from going from explainable to a learnable, right? Understanding ourselves afresh, right? So thank you for that. I'd like to go to Professor Shilpa Pandit next. Very eclectic background, deep knowledge about Indian knowledge systems and how that intersects with social policy, development, psychology. Professor, what does this book mean to you from that multidisciplinary perch that you so uniquely occupy?
So first of all, thank you for organizing this conversation. I'll keep it very brief. I think Ashwin did a great job of setting the theoretical programmatic questions well. First thing is, I think as a social psychologist, so I would like to go 3 points on 3 positions, which is as a social psychologist, as a social action researcher, and as a person who has engaged with Indian knowledge systems. The first one is that as a social psychologist, reconstituting meaning, linking with what Ashwin said, is central in whatever we say as history and or future forming. So constituting and reconstituting meaning is a process that happens most of the times fairly deliberately. And the lived experience of constituting and reconstituting meaning in spirals is a continuous process in human experience in itself. So this gives us the next step possibly of the questions that Ashwin asked, and also the background or the framework that Sai Deepak frames in his book. The second part in as social psychologist is that, I agree with him that, this book doesn't constitute a movement, but it reflects a movement. So there was always a movement on decolonization in social sciences. Now this has spilled over, so to say. And it's good that it has spilled over to public conversation, because now they should add an impetus to do better theory work, better work on ground, etc. One key point that he points out in his book, which I thought was good to work on and very specific, was the unit of analysis, where he discusses that it is not the individual but the group or groups, he says, quotes. Now, that question is a question of law as well. And that question needs much more detailed work. Because in general, social decision making at different levels of analysis of how does decision making happen, how does accountability gets accepted or fixed, and so on. So it is true that the unit of analysis is not the individual, fine, but how do we now process forward? That's point number one. The second point is, as a psychologist who has engaged with social action, I think 2 important debates in this book, which we have to take forward for detail, is the ecological embeddedness that he talks about and the rawness with which he talks about it. I think that's wonderful. And this worldview of and embeddedness in the natural processes is something that we really need to gather again and catch it, as it were, to take it forward more deliberately, to reconstitute the meaning of our experiences as we are embedded in this ecosystem. That's a question which is future forming as well. Now, as a person who has engaged with Indian knowledge systems, including studying Sanskrit and studying Vedanta, I think the third point, which is tied to consciousness, is really the issue of concepts and processes that constitute and reconstitute meaning in our languages. So we have, and I would put languages closest to consciousness, to take it forward for detail. Because, we have a person like Ashwin Kumar who has worked with Kannada. And in Kannada, which is not my language, we have a person called Kuvempu, who actually calls out a manifesto of this consciousness. It says, O Nanna Chetana, Agu Ni Aniketana. This is in a very, very non-religious context, he's saying. So he's talking about something which is like a theme, which is like a drone of the Tanpura, which is going on and on and on, and saying, find that unbroken, unbounded possibilities of human living. And that reconstitution is the third important point that we need to detail out as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. As always, it sets the agenda for educators. And I think there are a few PhD theses that can come out of your short dialogue just now. But one point I'd like to just reflect on and prod all of our audience as well to think about how a work from outside academia can influence and inspire people in academia to take up more responsibility, something that you have brought out as well, right? So I think this combination, this partnership of thinkers, practitioners, and people who have, who have the responsibility of teaching our future generations, I think there is also an alchemy to be created there for all of your own wish list as well to find its fruition. So thank you for that. I'd like to go on to Dr. Rinku Vadera. Dr. Vadera, your specialization and your whole field of work has been, of course, there's been a lot of Indian knowledge systems and indigenous worldview. But you have actually lived the experience of an indigenous community, working with them, not just as a researcher, but as also one of them, particularly the folk traditions of Uttarakhand region. So I'm very interested, and I'm sure this will be a very fresh perspective for our audience as well. What does a book like this mean for somebody who's practicing, who tries to bridge the gap between the theory, the knowledge, and the lived experience, both bottom-up and the top-down process? How do they synthesize, and what this book means to you in that process? You're on mute, Dr. Vadera. Yeah, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Please go ahead if you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Raghavji. Thanks, Scotch Foundation, for inviting me. And J. Sai Deepakji, heartfelt congratulations on your very, very fine book that has raised many questions and also raised the consciousness of people. And for me, the key takeaway was your question on the indigeneity of traditions. So in that context, as Raghavji has asked me to think about it upside down and from bottom up, I think I would like to think from the core to the outside. We know that the realm of folk serves a very, very important purpose, since it serves a lot of people according to their ruchi, their adhikar. And the knowledge traditions all evolve from an orthopraxic core, and layer upon layer, through the Vedas, Agamas, Tantras, they expand into the Puranic core. Then comes the core of the folk traditions. So epistemic knowledge is concentrated at the core. It keeps diluting as we go out of these concentric circles. But the ontological aspect, the ontological content throughout these sheets remains constant. So it means that the folk traditions are very, very closely linked to the Vedic knowledge. Now, what the missionaries did, as you have also recounted in your book, J. Sai Deepak, I would like to add just a little bit of it. And one would be my own experience of my own family. The other would be of one association of the folk tradition with the village deity tradition. As far as my own account is concerned, I have watched my own grandfather perform this very, very curious and a very, very effective ritual of removing the toothache, relieving people of toothache. If you were to Google Kashipur in Uttarakhand region, in Udham Singh Nagar, you will find the Mohalla Killa. It has been named after my great-grandfather and his forefathers who practiced the art of relieving toothache by the process of kilna, as in nailing the pain. And what he would do is he would write the mantra on a piece of paper and he would ask the person with the toothache to hold that particular tooth. And he would then start to hammer the nail down on either the road in front of the house or on the threshold of the house, his own house. And thereafter, there were so many nails on that road that it is now known as Mohalla Kila. Now, the second association that I would draw is the association of village deities with medicine. Now, we all know that our traditional medicine systems have been always closely associated with the deities. Now, this is an account that I'm going to recount of one gentleman called Holwell. And his topic is an account of the manner of inoculating for smallpox in the East Indies. Now, he clearly tells us that Brahmins from Vrindavan, Banaras, and Allahabad traveled the length and breadth of North India to inoculate people against smallpox. And they would finish this process before the onset of Basant. Now, smallpox is very closely associated with Shitla. Shitla is the cool one, but she generates heat, which was an enigma for the British, but they went along with this knowledge tradition until about 1821. We come to know from David Arnold that the European medical people were looking at the Indians for treating many diseases. Now, the Charter Act of 1813 comes in and all this changes. But before that, what the Brahmins were doing is they were inoculating people against Shitla through a very, very methodical process of sterilizing the area and administering males and females differently for the variolation, and also not administering variolation to children below 5 years of age because it was considered dangerous. And the missionary accounts themselves tell us that this was nearly 99% effective. It is only later when we know that 1874 and all, there were numerous deaths due to smallpox in India. The missionaries tell us, the Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society in 1874 says the work of the doctor is to open the door that a missionary may walk in. So what the missionaries did was put a petition to the monarchy, explaining to them that the village deities were not related to the Hindu tradition. They were not related to religion at all. And therefore, since they were cut off from the religion, they were cut off from the medicine, they could be ousted altogether. Now, another instance that I want to take up is that of the pilgrimage. Now, the pilgrimage, as we all know, is a very, very sacred encounter for Hindus, the eternal and the extraordinary. It is an inward metaphorical journey. It is an existential encounter. It is a spiritual quest for oneself. But what the Indian government did, even in 2019, is invite 12 different universities to study the Kumbh Mela. Now, what is it in us that begets this kind of validation from outside? Now, what is my objection to entire process of inviting foreigners into a pilgrimage is their gaze is very different from the indigenous gaze. What harm can they do? Now, look at this. What they did is they installed medical health checkup camps. They installed applications on their tablets. They drew data from pilgrims, from sadhus, and from even security personnel who gave them their Aadhaar numbers openly. Now we download masked Aadhaar cards. But what did we do to these people who had set up camp in the Kumbh Mela? We gave them our details very freely and without any reservations. So what they did out of that is, they said that out of this spatial model, we are going to create a model so that chaos can be handled. South Asia Institute put up something called the Jan Swasthya Project. If you pay attention to the name, the Jan Swasthya Project would sound like a government of India scheme. Again, people gave up all their data to these people, even their dental records. Now, dental records are always kept confidential. Even all medical records are confidential. But if you take the instance of the army, the dental records are confidential because your identity can be linked to the dental records. But we gave all these freely to these people. Now, what happens when you give up your area and your territory and your realm to the foreigners? There is the erasure of the sacred through exoticizing. There is distortion, there is secularization of the Mela itself. Mela is a rich source of knowledge and rich source of appropriation and digestion of material, of knowledge, which is indigenous to us. Now, what these people also did is, one of the institutes was the Weill Cornell Global Emergency Health Institute, and their Health and Human Rights Department at Harvard. They began documenting cases of human rights violations. They began documenting studies on venereal diseases and epidemics like cholera. So this was like missionary work all over again. And I think, J. Sai Deepakji, you have done a fabulous job in bringing all this account into the open. You have given us ground to work on, In fact, I have also thought of certain questions which I would like to share later in my work and in this conversation also. For now, I will hand over the mic to Raghavji. Thanks, Raghavji.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vadera, for this. A lot of us, when we read books, we imagine the link between a knowledge tradition, lived experiences, and future. With your experience of actually living with communities, observing them, and explaining to us how knowledge informs the daily lives and how access and just the ability to synthesize knowledge with your lived experience and the loss of that leads to all ability to make sense of the world itself and also the strategy behind that. Thank you for bringing that out. I'd like to actually pass all of these back to Sai Deepakji and invite his thoughts and his opinion if he has any reflections on this at this point.
So I'll go in a stepwise fashion. First is the question raised by Ashwinji, which is to say, is the goal to realize a model, or is the goal to create circumstances or an environment which is conducive to our experiential way or our experiential approach to these aspects? Perhaps I will fall back on that particular part of the book wherein I say that some of these experiences are irreversible completely. So it may not be possible for us to go back to that experiential state fully until we actually realize that the fundamental system on the basis of which the so-called modern society has been established is broken from within. And that realization has not come about. Anyone who makes this statement is first going to be accused of being a beneficiary of this particular system, because he's going to be told all the technology through which you speak is the product of the system. The car that you drive in is a product of this particular system. And therefore, what gives you the authority to ask for this particular system to be toned down when you constantly seem to benefit from the existence of the system? Well, that is not an individual folly. That is how the system works, because all of us have become dependent on it, and we are integral, or let's say we are dispensable cogs in otherwise a forcibly indispensable system, which is to say it's been imposed and it's really difficult to break it down. And dare I say this is going to be extremely problematic. I think the central problem is the much doubted virtue of globalization. The problem is globalization. Globalization is not a virtue according to me, because that effectively has the consequence of harmonization, whether you like it or not, for one reason or the other. And the moment you go after globalization, out comes the label of xenophobia and isolationism. And when you ask for certain communities' rights to be left alone, it's surprising that in the in the era of internet privacy, we are now asking questions of whether I have the right to be left alone in an interconnected world in the online space. We are happy to entertain the question, But when the very same question is sought to be applied in the physical world, which is to say, don't communities have the right to be left alone? That is accused of xenophobia. So the argument of how the culture of a particular community is effectively stopped the moment it moves on to reservations in America actually points to the fact that these are rooted systems. And the moment you take them away from a particular environment, it's going to be extremely difficult to reconstitute or to repackage it as purely a knowledge system, because that knowledge system is the product of the environment that they have lived in and is the product of lived experience of several generations. So effectively, most of these pre-Abrahamic systems, for all practical purposes, were the product of the engagement between the individual and the community and the environment that they lived in. Now, how do you recreate that particular environment unless and until you're pushed to ask the central question, is this how you wish to deal and engage with nature? It comes back to that central question. Now, the problem is the moment you ask this question, you enter the territory of development, you enter the territory of economics, and the only thing that I say perhaps at the end of section 1 is that I genuinely hope that climate change and the debate surrounding climate change pushes some of us into this sensible direction. Because when you realize that you've started living in a house that is already burning, that is when perhaps you'll be forced to ask, at what cost do you want to continue with this obsession with globalization and its impact? So according to me, that's where the entire thing is, which is, if the fear of a doomsday scenario, will it at least hopefully drive some sense, is the only solution that I'm capable of offering at this point. And despite the last 2 years, after the last 2 years, things are back to square one. One hoped that after this lockdown, people would have learned their lessons, but the travel patterns, to vacationing patterns, it feels as if people have been let loose on nature, because they just can't seem to be at one place. I'm not against travel. I love traveling, but the fact of the matter is, if you choose to travel, it comes at the expense of somebody's right to inhabitation in a certain place without being interfered with. So the points made by Ashwinji and the points made by Shilpaji and Rinkuji, they have a common theme there, which is to say, unless and until you fundamentally question this basic aspect, look at it this way. You will not respect it as long as the pattern of sensing changes. And that effectively means your definition of knowledge and what constitutes rationality will also have to change. Otherwise, the example that is being given by Rinku Vaderaji will be dismissed as superstition at the outset, immediately. That is not a knowledge system under any circumstances, according to the Medical Council of India. Right? Because you will be told, on what basis are you going to establish this? Where is the paper for this? Where is the approval from the ICMR, the Indian Council for Medical Research? What are the standards of clinical trials you're going to apply to this? The stupidity of even seeking to apply those standards to this entire system will be lost on them. If people are not willing to recognize Ayurveda at par with allopathy, what happens to these systems? If Ayurveda doesn't stand a chance, even these systems cannot even hope to have any kind of a, let's say, logical audience. So to the best of my understanding, I think I'll draw from the dark humor of Carlson, I think, or Carson, where he specifically says, if you think that your acts will destroy nature, please realize nature can never be destroyed. You will be destroyed ultimately, and nature will find a way to hit reset. Okay, which is to say, it will find a way to reinvent itself. It will live. The question is whether you will live. So you're not doing any favors to nature by hoping to change your behavior. So I'm genuinely hoping, at the expense of sounding dark and paranoid or whatnot, that hopefully there will be some polarizing experience which will force us to ask these existential questions. Because every time we have this question, you won't believe this. A couple of months ago, immediately after the launch of the book, I think about 3 or 4 months after the launch of the book, a friend comes and asks me, and he's a constitutional lawyer. And he practices on the criminal side as well as on the constitutional side. His entire point was, what is the practical value of the book that you've written? I wanted to say, do you realize this is the entire essence of the book? You're begging the question of the book itself, because this is what I'm trying to tell you. So he said, you should write a book on how do we set right a certain policy, or what changes do we make to a particular law. But this level of abstraction that you've entered into, I just don't see its value from a legal perspective. I said, this is the audience. This is among the well-read people. This is a person who is well-read according to his own assessment, and even my own assessment. But if this was the question, look at the level of the problem. Look at the level of the problem. That's all I have to say.
Thanks. And I think your passion for ecology and bringing out the fundamental lens of our planetary survival through your work. And you speak about land ontologies, you speak about worldviews. And I think that impulse comes through very strongly in the book. And it took me back to a moment of personal epiphany. And this is from an Indic knowledge systems perspective. Nature requires diversity in material to create new forms of life. It's not doing for us, it is the very act of nature. Right? But it is the cultural diversity that protects the biodiversity. There is an inextricable link, inexhaustible link between the biodiversity and cultural diversity. And what we call OET, or what we call dharmic tradition, or an Indic worldview, indigeneity in our context, is the ability to fuse this link between biodiversity and cultural diversity. A small area in Uttarakhand protecting that shrub or protecting that tradition is actually protecting the material for nature to experiment. And in that experimentation, new forms of life are possible. So you're right, absolutely, that it's not that we are saving the planet. It is that the planet is allowing us a kind of extended lease. And I think we are burning that at a fast pace. And I think this book, if one takeaway from this book, should actually be, exhaustively looked at, it is the link between development and ecology and technology. It also took me back to, you quote S.M. Balagangadharaji quite heavily in your book, and you've drawn from the works. And he has a take on globalization and very prescient observation. He says that globalization, apart from the technologies, also exports the nature of conflicts. There's a certain kind of conflict that globalization exports along with its technologies. So I think that aspect has to be critiqued and observed both academically, socially, and also, more importantly, politically. Latest piece by one of the thinkers around this, he calls the planet a political orphan. And I think the link between global institutions, culture, social life, and knowledge is a lot of work for us to do on that. So thank you for that. I'd like to quickly take one or two questions back to the panel, because there are also questions from the audience that I'd like to engage in a few minutes. I'd quickly like to ask Professor Ashwin Kumarji, who's written extensively about the link between language, nationalism, and how communities out of their volition create this, and how the Western civilization has crafted this, and what does this mean to us. So Professor Kumar, in the context of what Sai Deepak ji has just said, how do you link this to your work of doxastic communities, and what does it mean to you?
Sure. I think even when I was reading the book, I was so happy to see that there's a rich conversation possible between what I've tried to do and what Deepak has tried to set out to do. To give a quick summary of the central idea, it's something like this, and it speaks to many of the concerns that both Vadhera-ji, Shilpa, and Deepak raised just now, which is this, that think about the most ordinary situation in which a community sees itself as a community. Now, what ensures the continuity of a community? There may be 3 or 4 things. I mean, there may be many things, but at least 3 or 4 things. One would be internal marital relations. People marry people from their own communities. Beginning from about the 7th, 8th century and going all the way until about the 16th century, the Christian church abolished consanguineous marriages. And today, the consanguineous marriages in Europe is less than a few decimal percentage points. It's not even 1%. Which means that one of the conditions for the continuity and perpetuation of a community, a normal condition, if you were to ask, is removed. What is the second way by which a community sees itself as a community? Probably by by their own customary laws and ways of going about it. The people revolutions, about which I think Deepak also has an interesting remark, systematically replaces ecclesiastical law from out of all the different local laws as some kind of a superior alternative. It first begins by saying that if there is a conflict between two customary laws or two local laws, the ecclesiastical law holds sway. But going forward, it just says ecclesiastical law anyway holds sway. Okay, whether there is or there is no conflict, it doesn't matter. Which means one of the other identifiers of a community, that my community has rules and laws and customs which are different from your community, the very basis for that is destroyed by the ecclesiastical church. And the third one is your everyday goings about. What you think of as the right way of living as a Kshatriya is very different from what is a right way of living for a Brahmana versus what it is for someone else versus what it is for someone else. But the Western Church creates what today in the secular language can be called normative ethics, but really an ecclesiastical morality, which is universal, derived from some non-empirical origin called God or whatever, and is completely autochthonous. That is, it is perpetuating its own self-consistency forever. Yeah, which means this is the third way by which a community would have understood itself, which is by its own customs and laws. The church removes that also. So in a process of about 1,000 years, the 3 or 4 or 5 central ways by which a community understands itself as a community is replaced by the only way by which a community can understand itself, which is through its affiliation to the particular denomination of the church. There, the law becomes some kind of a conduit, of something of a contract between you and the church, which is what exactly it is today in modern secular countries. And I'm sure Deepak has to deal with the implications of this, 9 to 5, or I don't know what's the working hours of a Supreme Court lawyer, but it's probably 12 to 12. So here is something happening. This is a process, like you said, globalization exports these kinds of conflicts. Colonization seems to have exported this conflict. Look at the situation today that it is impossible for communities in India to organize their social life simply because exactly these 3 or 4 conditions that you're thinking of, for various reasons, get hampered. Now, of course, some of this is irreversible, as Deepak correctly mentioned. For Europe, it is definitely gone past the date where it can anyway think of reversibility. So this is not just true for India. So when I say nationalism comes into the picture in such a context, what I mean to say is here are communities which have been completely eviscerated, cleaned out of any practical mode of organization. On top of this comes nationalism to fill that gap. So nationalism is now the mode by which you organize yourself, because all the other modes of organization have been rendered defunct by the church. And this is true for Europe, never mind India. Now imagine if such a kind of a system is exported, lock, stock, and barrel, to communities which are still alive, which are still having some last lease of dynamism in them. It is quite a lethal combination, which is one of the reasons why I think I say that the real question is not the post-colonials, whom Sai Deepak very nicely takes to task. And I was like, licking the whatever in saying that. So they do this. They say that nationalism is distorted when it goes outside the Western context. I think no, that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's not nationalism which is distorted when it comes to the non-West. It is nationalism that distorts other modes of social organization, and that is what has to be seen and understood and reconstituted. And rediscovered as to what is it that gets distorted, and that would be the ways by which communities organize themselves. And we talked about this earlier on also, that this is the basis of the formation of larger structures like the state, which is true for common law England. That the state, the common law state, the monarchical state, and I think there's a very insightful thing that Deepak mentions. He mentions it in a different context. He says the princely states were largely Hindu in character. One of the ways of interpreting it, for me at least, is to say that the princely states were states built on the existing social, communities and modes of organization of this country. And the story of the exportation of Western nationalism to India is the story of the destruction of these forms of life. So yeah, that was largely what I was trying to argue, and which is why when I was reading Sai Deepak's book, I was saying, here is a co-traveler.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Professor. I'd like to pose one last question about the existential issue, and I'd like Dr. Shilpa Pandit to answer this before I go to a few audience questions. Dr. Pandit, you apart from the social psychology dimension, you are also a practitioner, theorist, and a passionate advocate of well-being in general and mental health in particular, and the link between worldview, mental health, and well-being, and the link between consciousness and worldview, and what the process of colonization does to that. I wanted you to just tell us how we are intimately and very personally and deeply connected to this entire chain of consequences.
So thank you. I'll be very brief again, but the discussion is really very interesting. It's like,
I know.
it could go on really well. Now, central point that Deepak mentioned, this irreversible loss of experience or ability to reconstitute that experience, because that experience is co-created with that environment, or that ecological consciousness is central to the multiple Indian ways of being, central to that. And that consciousness has not been binarized into embodied and transcendental and so on. So it is existing everywhere. So that logic of Vedanta actually gives that centrality and availability to that consciousness. The more we kind of have binarized and separated self, other, and reason, affect, several of these boundaries that stay, that consciousness is blocked somehow now in the brain, and in the brain processes and in certain neurotransmitters, has actually created little maneuverability space. So yes, few people will meditate and few people will actually experience, but the possibility of an ever expanding consciousness allows you to maneuver in the pragmatic circumstances that we live. So this irreversible loss of experience point that we have been really struggling with, I think we really have as a community to get that cognitive energy to see what is that which is remaining really, and then work on those points again and again. It is going to take a lot of energy for us, but perhaps that's the only satisfying point about reconstituting or co-constituting that subjectivity again and again and again. And I think that is where we will have to have that future forming agenda from an Indic point of view. For example, last point, that the word dharma, is such a beautiful word, but it is so conventionally misinterpreted. And so the idea of dharma in itself can give rise to these consultations on constituting subjectivity. And so that's where I think I will stop, because the dharma itself, if understood from a psychologist's point of view, gives rise to, it is mental health, dharma, if we understand it in that way. So I think with this I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I think like the quintessential Indic tradition, we start with dharma, we end with dharma. and the idea of dharma as mental health, as well-being. I think that's the real future forming agenda. I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience, just maybe very quick, 1 or 2 points. I know that we've ran out of time and I apologize for that. Saidipalji, there is one question for you. Western universities are quite skilled at producing a steady supply of post-colonial minds and material, many of them which can be spotted in our academia, media, and even polity. How does this book help us in identifying colonial and post-colonial mindsets, and what do you propose to do with them?
So there is a extremely political aspect of academia that comes in the way of this, which is that those who try and move out of the post-colonial space, whether you like it or not, you may end up finding some overlaps with what you see as the left, particularly when it comes to aspects of environment. The goals may be different, but some of the issues that they take up, you end up having to share space as far as those issues are concerned. Now, when that happens, the problematic aspect in today's atmosphere is that all the discussions that we just had on environment would typically have to be bracketed or basketed. Is this a Luddite position? Is this a capitalist position? Is this a communist position? Is this a tree-hugging position? These are the standard questions that I have to answer. Or for that matter, Rinkuji or Shilpaji will have to answer. What do you mean by this? Are you saying that the person in Uttarakhand doesn't have the right to have the same roads as people in Delhi? This will be the next question that will be thrown at you. Now, the moment you reduce such an important issue to having roads in Uttarakhand, now effectively the scale of the analysis has gone completely, according to me, bonkers. It's off the rocker completely. So to my mind, the first thing that if we want to produce a steady supply of people who are able to think out of the box on these aspects, frankly, I think the problem with that question itself is the assumption is that there aren't enough already. There are people who are doing it. The problem is they don't get platforms. They're deplatformed on a regular basis. They're cancelled on a regular basis because the position that they take will effectively mean taking back the so-called weaponization of tribal identity and making it Indic. And therefore, the cannon fodder that these people have been producing will be gone. The captive audience on the basis of which they've been creating a steady supply of, let's say, anti-dharmic positions and anti-dharmic individuals would be lost. So I don't think it's a question of producing a steady supply of people. That's a secondary question. The first question is, how do you support the existing scholars who are already doing this by ensuring that their work comes out in public domain? So I say this without an iota of false modesty. I am not humble. I don't have a single modest bone in my body. I believe that as far as my book is concerned, it is an attempt to showcase the work of all these scholars to say, I have built on the shoulders of giants. So treat this as the catalog of their work and go back to what they have to say. So I'm questioning the factual premise of the question, which is to say that there aren't enough people already. Well, if that's the case, I don't think my book would have come forth. I don't have what it takes by way of first-hand original research to have put this book together. I have built on original research that others have done. So one, how do you sustain that? And then how do you create a legacy where that particular intellectual tradition is passed on to next generation? How do you create an incentive there? Now, this is where, unfortunately, this is not just a question of experience. This is also a question of going back to Mr. Rashan Kumar's point of creating a sustainable model. Unfortunately, the contemporary world understands models better than experience. So you'll have to find a way of using model to push them towards experience, so that you're able to show that this is the pilot. This is how it works. This is the result it is capable of showing. As long as you're able to do that, then you may have some kind of an incentive to pull more people into that particular direction. That would be my answer.
Thank you so much for that. Maybe the Indic mind would say stories and aphorisms as means of communicating knowledge and wisdom is the pedagogy that we need to reclaim. I know that there are many other questions that we would like to discuss. You're sitting among some academics, so we can go on for many hours, but unfortunately, your time is at a premium and our audience time is even more at a premium. But I think we have a very, very solid agenda in front of us. Some of it has emerged as part of this conversation too. And I hope this also kindles a culture of conversation between practitioners, academicians, and bridges the gap between theory and practice. I'd like to thank SKOCH Foundation once again for recognizing this important work. Yes, please go ahead.
Just one clarification. Both Shilpa ji and Ashwin ji, the next two books will not answer the questions raised in the first book, because the next two books will continue to analyze the problem, because I've only analyzed one aspect of the problem that comes from Europe. I have not answered or I have not analyzed a problem that was even before Europe. And so that is what the second book will do. The third book will effectively merge both streams and explain how it influenced the shaping of the constitution. Now I've called it a Bharat trilogy, but from the looks of it, it may become effectively the foundation for future works. So then I will pick up each vertical from each of these books and then convert that into targeted analysis of each of those verticals. But for now, it's going to be an analysis of the problem until 1950. And the second book will effectively talk about the problematic period from the 18th century till 1925, creating what I would call the problematic green flag in the South Asian part of, or let's say this part of this world. So let's talk about it once the book is out.
Look forward to that. And thank you once again for your time. And I think it's once again back to the Indian method that there is serendipity with the structure, and you allow for emergence and co-creation to happen. Thank you once again, Saideep, and thank you, SKOCH Foundation, for this opportunity to talk about an important work and hand it over back to the team at SKOCH.
Let me just thank all of the scholars for taking their valuable time out, for participating in this discussion, and for your feedback on the book. I will try and incorporate these suggestions in my future works. Thank you so very much for inspiring people like me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for making this discussion extremely lively. And in fact, such a subject, which is, reflecting on partly, as your subject happens to be Shilpaji, which is what, psychology, and we're talking about existentialism. And we also look back as to, how is it that it has gone with people working on their psyches. And definitely, Deepakji, as you said, that your next and the next book is going to fill up those gaps when it comes to further questioning. And perhaps we would see a fourth one, which is going to answer all these questions, which is what you have raised in the first three ones. Well, congratulations for contributing to the existing body of knowledge. It's been a great experience interacting with you all. Thank you very much and have a good night.